So let me get on with introductions. I'm Catherine Needham. I'm based at the University of Birmingham, where I'm Professor of Public Policy, Public Management in the Health Services Management Centre. So this is the third of the SSCR webinars. I guess one of the things that we've been forced into by COVID, but is actually, I certainly have been doing much more than I have ever had in the past around webinars and finding them really helpful and a great use of an hour. I'm getting a message saying my internet connection is unstable, so apologies if I drop out, but I'm not the person you're here to listen to, so hopefully my internet won't have a bearing on the quality of the experience today. It's being recorded, so just bear that in mind. In terms of the questions, so the two presenters that we've got, who I'll introduce in a moment, will present for 20 minutes, and then we've got 10 minutes for questions. I'm going to collect up questions via the chat function, so if you've got a question, put it in the chat during the presentation or towards the end, and then I'll pick, depending on how much time we've got, I'll pick 2 or 3 questions that reflect the kinds of things people want to ask to the presenters.
Thank you very much. It's fantastic to be able to talk about this research, and obviously with what's going on currently nationally, I know many of us in this virtual room will be very concerned about what's happening in terms of isolation in care homes. And so we're looking at one particular group of that around sight loss in care homes, but very much focused on the isolation and loneliness aspects. I agreed with Paul, our next speaker. I'll just cover a little bit of a narrative really about loneliness, set a little bit of the scene. I mean, we do like a crisis in social care, don't we? I'm conscious of there's some research funded by SSCR through the Social Care Futures Network looking at framing and social care. And you know, we'll be aware that there's a discourse around this loneliness crisis facing those in later life. And the statistics do sound scary. You know, the idea that there's over 1 million chronically lonely people in the UK, that there's 500,000 of those that might go for a week without meaningful social interaction, that so many say television is their main company. And it's undoubtedly true that loneliness has that substantial impact on people's well-being where that occurs. And there's also research that's suggesting there's important health consequences as well. Suggestions that it's life-limiting, that's a headline that's touted about is that loneliness is as bad for your health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and it's worse than obesity. And to be fair, there is some fairly interesting and compelling evidence linking loneliness to dementia, although assigning causal effects to a lot of the other sort of health consequences is really difficult to sort of prove. Nevertheless, it's something that's obviously got there's a concerted local and national effort to really address this. We'll have seen they've grabbed policy attention. We've seen the campaign to end loneliness be so successful in the wake of Joe Cox's untimely death, that this is very high on the political and policy agenda. I mean, whether or not loneliness is a problem of old age is worth something just thinking about. I mean, it's certainly true that social networks dwindle in later life. You know, I don't remember in my 20s ever being members of networks with that many people in them, but apparently that's common on the left of this graph. But you can see this is US data, but it's fairly common to see that in later life, certainly those sort of other categories of networks tend to disappear or certainly shrink. And that sits with the idea that whilst the overall circle of social contacts reduce, then older people are perhaps devoting more attention and more of their energies towards those perhaps that matter, their family, their close friends and their neighbours, those networks that tend to stick. But nevertheless, with that shrinking of the overall sort of social network sizes does come that heightened risk of isolation. Whether or not that affects people's perceptions of loneliness is quite a complex subject, and there's a literature on this as long as my my lockdown hair. You can see from this graph that towards the bottom of these lower 3 dotted lines, these are those that are most or always lonely. And there's this U-shaped pattern. So actually people in their younger ages of life, when their networks are the biggest, also suffer, and perhaps more so, this loneliness phenomenon. It tends to reduce over the working life, and it actually amongst your 60s and 70s, then you will still have less loneliness than most younger people. But then there's this problem as we seem to enter into later older age, when frailty and health complaints become more common, bereavement becomes more common, and dementia becomes more common. There seems to be something that happens at around this sort of time period. And it is worth then just thinking about what exactly is loneliness, so we're on the same page. There are some formal academic definitions. I quite like this one instead, because it's very simple. It's when you feel sad because you're not part of companionship or society. And that actually also highlights the 2 forms of loneliness that are often looked at in the literature. Both the emotional loneliness, the aspect where what you're searching for is those sort of close and intimate relationships, and then the social loneliness, which is really about your membership of wider social groups and networks. And it's possible to be lonely in either one or both of those dimensions, or not, neither. And it's worth reminding us, just in terms of the science of this, that often loneliness is thought of as a sort of a psychological process, where we go from, there are objective aspects of loneliness, but there's also then this cognitive step and an emotional sort of reaction and feeling to that. So that's my context setting. And I want to talk about then this specific project that is looking at the care homes. So we know that actually all that prevalence data I mentioned, it's really has been seen as quite concerning within care homes, where the prevalence of severe loneliness looks to be sort of twice those of community dwelling sort of counterparts. And also trying to focus on the fact that within care homes, there are groups that seem to find forming and maintaining social relationships even more challenging than others. And those with sight loss, we know in community and general.
Mark, do you want to, I think you froze for a while there. You were just talking about the particular issue of people with sight loss in care homes. Do you want to pick up again from there?
Okay. I tell you, I don't know at what point you missed me, but I'll just mention here that this is me taking credit for another person's research. This is Pavne Rabier, who's since retired, and is she was the sort of the brains behind this research. But we've also got a good network of carers and practitioners and others who've helped us with the co-resourcing, co-production of the resources. So what we wanted to do is try and increase our understanding of sight loss and how it interacts and causes potentially isolation and loneliness in care homes, and to try and look at how people characterize loneliness, about the different dimensions of loneliness, and to also trying to look at those encouraging sort of care home practices that seem to be able to ameliorate some of the impact. And then trying to then come to a point where we're co-producing resources that can actually help care homes to deliver better support for people with sight loss. And we went about it, this was actually several stages to this study. I'm just talking about the qualitative research today. So this is where we interviewed residents with sight loss, where we sampled these from 11 care homes with a mix of residential nursing and also a specialist home for people with sight loss. They were all research ready thanks to the support of the NIHR network. And you can see some of the, we defined sight loss as essentially any visual impairment that couldn't be corrected by glasses. And there were just 3 that were blind, with the remainder having some form of residual sight. And often they had other impairments as well, of course, which led them to be sort of supported within care homes. We also spoke to family members and also to some care home managers, and I think actually an activity sort of coordinator as well. I can't remember exactly where that fit in with these, but that hopefully gives you a flavour. I'll just talk about these findings in three parts about how people came to conceptualise their own and talk about their own loneliness. And then we'll focus on the four dimensions of loneliness that were apparent, and then focus on drawing out the sort of the key encouraging bits of practice that I hope people can take away with them. So in terms of residents' own assessments, we did just mentioning about the quantitative bit, we did do a survey of residents assessing their loneliness, and it was about 1 in 6 people with vision impairment that really had problematic loneliness scores that would be seen as quite severe. So it is a problem, but when we spoke in the qualitative interviews, generally people were quite satisfied with their social well-being. They did talk about, there was evidence really of them normalising their experience, that this is all that they wanted at their age, that they were quite used to being on their own, that the days just pass, that you do get over it, and that it's actually something that's difficult to avoid. And what was clear was that no one really expected care homes, no one was looking for this problem, such as it was a problem, to be resolved for them. It was interesting that they certainly were against the idea that care homes were there to occupy or to entertain them. They did see them predominantly as being there to provide and meet their sort of care and residence sorts of needs, rather than that occupational aspect in general. In terms of some of the dimensions of loneliness, then at an intellectual level, certainly we heard that social connections were not all that stimulating. And that involved positioning themselves, that at times there was a sort of a sense that people were saying that, well, no one really wants to talk to me with my, you know, I'm seen as one of those at the more sort of severely ill end, and because of my vision impairment, people tend to underestimate what I'm able to do. But also then participants themselves were positioning others so that they didn't really want to speak to people who were not at their level. They sensed that they were often put with, for example, people who perhaps had cognitive impairments or were located with others where they felt that, you know, they weren't able to sort of engage in conversations that were what they were particularly looking at. And for some also a sense that other people's interests and the intellect weren't sort of well matched to their own. And certainly there was concern about the type of activities that were on offer, that there was a degree of what other researchers have called institutionalized recreation, that sort of program that perhaps involves many different people, tries to involve everyone within the care home. And sometimes that wasn't really something that they enjoyed. So the idea that, you know, someone saying that they're a professional person and they don't want to play games, they don't want to handle snakes and spiders when they've had visitors come in, and sometimes feeling that some of those activities are not really suited to them, and perhaps they're silly, in the words of one person, and they're activities that don't exercise the mind. And we got that as well, this sort of idea potentially of over-inclusion, where activities were sort of set up, that actually residents, it was difficult to see to what end, what was the purpose behind some of the activities, where the people with sight loss couldn't engage in the same way as other people, but they were nevertheless sort of tried to be involved. And this may go a little way towards trying to understand why people seem to find some of the activities less stimulating than other residents. There were a lot of physical environmental barriers to sort of social participation, and a tendency for people to prefer their own rooms to communal areas. That includes sort of a sense of embarrassment about sort of having needs in being able to, having to be shown around, for example. And then the difficulties of background noise making conversation particularly difficult when you can't have that, the other visual communication to help things along. And then some solutions which actually created new problems, like I mentioned before, that by opening up certain areas for people with vision impairment, but also then those with dementia and more complex health needs, might have sort of contributed to this idea where people were positioning others as different to themselves. There was certainly some problems around the few emotional bonds being formed within care homes. The idea that friends that you make here, I'm quoting someone, are a different kind of friend than the sort you spend your life with. Friendly, but not friends, they're just acquaintances. And someone saying it's not like ordinary life. I'm being brief on this because there was quite a lot in here, but this tallies quite a lot with the existing literature on care homes, and I'm not sure it's necessarily specifically a difference when it comes to sight loss. Just the last one of these around institutional aspects. There was clearly a yearning for being able to restore some of the contacts that had been lost outside the care homes. And certainly there's a sense that people were not able to keep in touch with what was going on locally. And people were dependent on their own social networks, which sometimes were more difficult to maintain where there was sight impairment. And some of the little things like the, you know, not being able to read your local newspaper to be able to know what's going on locally. And you could always ask other people to read it for you, but there was also a sense that you have so many brownie points almost when you're a resident in the care home. You can only ask so much of care staff, and maybe you've already used up some of those sort of points when in other things, so that you didn't really feel you were able to ask for these perhaps what might be seen as non-essential extras. And there was a sense that perhaps safety obviously is such an important feature of care home life. And so is that something that is a particular concern when it comes to residents with sight loss? I'll just leave that this quotation, which sort of illustrates, I think, just some of the points that I was just making previously. Because I want to turn to the encouraging practice elements. So I think there were three that came out. I mean, the first one is a bit boring in some respects, but turns out to be absolutely crucial, that just doing the things that we know are good practice, but, you know, in the context of such, you know, care homes are such incredibly busy environments that it's very easy for, you know, for some things just not to take place routinely, and trying to make some of these things become habit would be, I think, a fantastic thing to achieve. Simple things, removing sources of noise and corridor buzzers were particularly beneficial. Some places, just making sure that, you know, corridors had an easy way of being able to navigate. Being able to choose where you sit and who you're sitting with was a particularly difficult issue when you couldn't see who you were, who else was seated within the area. And being on top of hearing aids, I mean, this was such an important thing, such a little thing, but, you know, how devastating it can be to lose you know, some of that really important sense of hearing when there are problems with sight. And also talk of often the best form of support with equipment and aids wasn't necessarily specialist organisations or services. That actually some care home managers talked about Facebook groups where they were able to talk about sort of what people had found helpful in other settings. Those informal networks were particularly positive. And the last thing, or second thing, trying to closely match the activities, trying to avoid this idea of having activities that were to suit and everyone should. There was a little bit of over-inclusion, I think. And trying, I mean, it worked best where residents were involved and the people with sight loss were saying that they were actually part of the sort of planning process for what was likely to be going on within care homes. This was generally found to be easier where care homes had a bonding feature, whether that was a religious sort of aspect to their establishment or one that was for people formerly of the armed forces, then that sort of helped with some of that aspect. And just the last thing, I think, was around trying to make most use of the care home's own social capital, you know, trying to think about the wider use, about drawing on church groups, about trying to, the friends of the care home type networks that some care homes were able to develop really seemed to make quite a difference when it came to keeping people in touch amongst those with sight loss. My conclusions, I think, are conscious of the time, that I would focus on that. The idea that care homes do seem to rely largely on their own internal resources. And I think, you know, trying to draw this into a lot of work that's going on at the moment about building community assets seems to be an important area for care homes to try and sort of build on. And I think that's a particular area for exploration about what might be an effective way of achieving that. So I just want to point you to some other resources which have existed that will help sort of hammer home some of our messages, hopefully try and help some care homes to be able to sort of pick up some of the learning from what we've done. A quick trailer for some other research that we're doing, which is looking at experiences of loneliness with colleagues at the University of Oxford and other places. Some dual references, and I shall pass back to Catherine. Thank you very much for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mark. That was a really interesting piece of work. I suppose that the kind of the finding about the importance of people's networks outside care homes seems particularly kind of poignant in the context of COVID, where we know that a lot of those networks have just had to kind of go on pause, and the implications that will clearly have had for people's sense of connectedness to the networks that are important to them. I'm keeping an eye on the chat for people's questions. Haven't seen any come through yet, but please do feel use this opportunity now to put any questions that you have in there. One question I had was, did you look at people's reasons for entry into the care home? I'm just wondering whether, you know, some people will have gone in at a point of crisis and not really maybe feel like they were able to make a kind of careful choice about going in. Maybe some others it was more of a kind of planned decision, and whether that then has a bearing on how they feel about being there and the kind of community in which they found themselves.
Yeah, no, I mean, we had a mix, as you might imagine, that there were certainly some people who were, so I remember some residents who ended up a very, very long way from their social networks, and because it was quite individual. In that case, it was because of the particular care home that he was really determined to go into, the particular sort of religious affiliation that was important to him. But as part of that, had left him quite distant from many of his family support networks. And that was something that he then, so he fulfilled some areas of his social needs, but also at the expense of some of the other aspects as well. And then, I mean, to my knowledge, none of the admissions was specifically related to sight loss. It was usually other sort of impairments and frailties that perhaps had been the contributing factor. And so, yeah, there was some crisis point placements where essentially that, you know, that was something that, as for many people, ends up it takes quite a long time to try and rebuild those regular contacts and networks after that happens, because it's not just a shock to the resident, it's actually a shock to the wider social network that they have to then work out. And, you know, how are we going to make these visits, at what time, what is the normal pattern within care homes, what's too much. So it's not just for the residents themselves, it was the care home members, family members that were saying that.
Thank you. I've got a couple more questions, and I'll probably cap it there just just so that we can move on and have plenty of time for Paul's presentation. So one is about the sort of, I guess, the nature of sort of bonding social capital, which is often that it can create groups which are somewhat exclusionary. And so I think there's a question is about sort of religious-based care homes can be a great setting for some people who want that, but they can potentially be exclusionary, perhaps for LGBT communities. So whether there's a sense that I suppose that kind of what creates the bonding is also potentially creates boundaries and exclusion.
Yeah, I think that's no doubt very true. It's not something that we looked at, and obviously these residents made that choice to go there at that time, and there were no LGBT residents that we spoke to, so there's not much that I can say about that. But it's cropped up in other research studies as well that I've been involved with, that sort of attempt to provide, whether it's culturally specific or sort of other characteristic specific interests, or something related to your value system or anything, when you try and cater for that, is there a potential that you end up creating new boundaries elsewhere? Yeah, it's an interesting area.
And then the final question, although there are some more there, and Mark, I'm sure you'll appreciate looking at those afterwards, is about whether the social networks included social media networks, so where people connected online. Yeah,
this was I thought really a little bit disappointing that I mean the setup within the care homes and the use of technology. I don't know what I was expecting, because this isn't really my particular specialist area, but I was certainly expecting greater use of digital technologies to be able to sort of maintain links and for use of social media. And it wasn't something that was taken up in this sort of small sample. And I know there's some other work that's sort of looking at social media within care homes and also other technologies as well to try and improve online communications, which is something that I'm sure this whole current situation will also change things in the future as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mark. That was a really interesting piece of work, and I'm sure we'll all look forward to reading more that comes from it. So we will move then over to Paul. So Paul's presentation is on older men at the margins, a study of older men's experiences of seeking social engagement and combating loneliness in later life. So Paul, I'll hand over to you and the screen sharing.
Great, thank you, Catherine. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, and you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Great, okay. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about this study. This is a study that we conducted at the University of Bristol between 2016 and 2019, looking at older men's experiences of loneliness, social isolation, and social connections across marginalised and less heard groups. So just to give you a little bit of background detail to the study, at the top there you see the University of Bristol team, and a couple of my colleagues, Alex and David, have joined us today for this webinar. The project was in collaboration with Age UK and the team there, and of course funded by the School for Social Care Research. So the study was about developing an in-depth understanding of the formal and informal ways in which men from seldom heard or hard to reach groups, all men 65 years and over, sought to stay socially connected and engaged in later life and combat loneliness. And this looked also at experiences of participation in groups and group-based activities which were targeting around reducing loneliness and isolation. So today I want to talk about loneliness talk, how men from different groups talked about loneliness, described loneliness, how it felt for them and their perceptions of it. And I want to look at older men's experiences as carers for significant others and how older male carers experience loneliness. For two reasons. This is Carers Week, just to raise awareness of that. And secondly, now more than ever during current and recent lockdown measures, isolation may be exacerbated for carers, particularly older carers who may have limited contact with other people outside that caring relationship. And just to flag up, we have a paper coming out very shortly in the International Journal of Care and Caring on older carers and loneliness. So Mark has done a fantastic job already in talking about background to understanding discourse of loneliness and how we think about and talk about loneliness in older age. I just wanted to flag up this diagram from Christina Victor and her colleagues and others that helps us tease apart what do we mean when we talk about loneliness. So just a couple of things. Loneliness is separate from social isolation. We may experience a feeling, a subjective feeling of loneliness, but we might be surrounded by other people around us and have regular contact with others around us, whether we're part of a busy household or busy neighborhood or a care setting with lots of other people around us. So it's not so much about the quantity or number of people we have contact with. Social isolation is more about how we measure people's or individuals' social contact with others and how much social contact they have with other people in their social networks and communities and neighborhoods. Living alone is a risk factor associated with experiencing of loneliness. But of course, a lot of people live alone, a lot of older people live alone, and they don't necessarily experience loneliness. So it's not a kind of presumed relationship between loneliness and living alone. And solitude is something that we all might seek and need from time to time. A lot of people might live in areas of isolation where they intentionally seek out time away from other people. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean that they experience loneliness. As Mark's acknowledged, there are different types of loneliness, and Mark's already spoken about emotional and social loneliness. I just wanted to flag up the third type there, existential loneliness, which has come out of scholarship and research in Scandinavian countries, where researchers there talk about a deeper sense of social separation, alienation, and disconnection from social life and society around you, which speaks to a more a spiritual or profound sense of loneliness in later life. So we focused on men in this study for a number of reasons, based on what we know from previous research. We know that women are more likely to have wider social networks than men across their lifetime. And there have been a number of studies that have touched on the ways in which women in heterosexual relationships often take responsibility for organising the social life and social calendar of households and families. And men often become reliant on older women, older partners and spouses to maintain that social calendar. And hence why a lot of men may struggle in widowhood with the death and loss of their spouse. And they're having to re-engage with people in their social network on their own terms. We also know some research in England, a greater percentage of older men 50 years and over report moderate to high levels of social isolation compared to older women. And we also know from European research that older men without partners report high levels of loneliness and isolation than women without partners. So the research suggests that older women fare better in terms of social well-being and social relationships on their own compared to men on their own. A little bit about the study. It was a qualitative study. We sought to recruit men from groups and services offering groups and clubs and societies, so we could learn about men's experience of those. So our recruitment sources were mainly in the southwest and west of England, included community services, forums, day centres, carer support services and groups, a whole range of different interest groups, societies, including U3A societies and clubs. Each gentleman that took part in the study participated in a semi-structured interview. We had a range of direct and indirect questions about loneliness. So for example, we would start by asking men how they would describe loneliness. What does it look like? Often a lot of men would then start to elaborate on what it meant for them, how it impacted on their day-to-day life. And we're also interested in men's social networks, and we used an illustrative diagram called a social convoy model to map out who's important to each participant and who's a key part of their day-to-day social world and what they mean to them. So we spoke to 111 men in total from across these 5 groups, and we deliberately focused on these 5 groups. Gay men who are single or living alone, men who are single or living alone in rural areas, men who are single and living alone in urban areas, men who are carers of significant others, and men who are living with hearing loss. And I'm going to focus today on the findings relating to the men who are carers of significant others, and compare that with some of the findings from the men who are single or living alone. So that include heterosexual men and gay men across rural and urban areas. Okay, so first of all, men who are single or living alone, and I should say this group also includes a small group of men from our hearing loss group who were also single and living alone. So there was crossover in terms of some of the issues that our men spoke about. So in their talk about loneliness, how they describe loneliness, men conveyed perceptions of being socially discarded, not having a sense of purpose, feeling like they're of little value to others, or feeling like nobody cares, similar sentiments like that, and a sense of being cut off from broader society or estranged from broader society. So we saw indications of social and emotional loneliness, as Mark spoke about those types of loneliness before. We saw these across men's descriptions, but we were particularly struck by these wider sentiments about separation, alienation, what we might say resonates with some of the literature and discussion about existential loneliness. So here's a couple of quotes. I'm just going to focus on the first one, where this participant says, "Loneliness to me means I'm entirely on my own. Nobody is with me," and I have to just move the people to the side so I can see the quote. "And I feel there's nobody around me, nobody sitting with me. There's nobody to talk to me. You know, I feel discarded. I feel left by human society," and things like that. That's my feeling, how I feel. And the second participant elaborates more on that sense of estrangement from what's going on out there in the broader society and community, and feeling like as though you're in a different world. As I mentioned before, a lot of men spoke about emotional loneliness, men who are single living alone more so. And this is associated with seeking companionship because a lot of the heterosexual men in this group were widowed, whether in recent years or had experience in widowhood in the last decades, or they'd been single for a long time. And this participant's talking about missing that opportunity for intimacy, for ordinary, everyday, affectionate gestures and acts, and a lack of opportunity to do something spontaneous and enjoy that with somebody else. So a loneliness associated with that lack of intimate companionship and those close bonds. Amongst the men who are single and living alone, there are lots of different life events that were associated with loneliness, or what we might describe as triggers for loneliness. As I mentioned before, in relation to widowhood, death of a spouse or partner being a major life event, a major life disruption. Relationship changes, including divorce and separation, living alone and for a long time and having less contact with others, restrictions by physical disability, mental health problems, or having lived long-term chronic illness, which impacts on how much contact you have with other people. Some men spoke about retirement and the related loss of role and responsibility and the social bonds and ties you build up with colleagues at work. And a small group of men talked about longer term loneliness, being alone more, and some of those interpersonal difficulties they'd experienced in forming friendships and maintaining those connections right back to childhood and adolescence that had kind of stuck with them as challenges throughout their lifetime. Okay, so I want to focus on carers and caregivers, just to contrast and show how their experiences differ from the other group of men who are men single or living alone. All these men are 65 years and over. So why focus on older carers first? We know, first of all, between 75 to 84 years of age, there are equal proportions of female and male carers. But at 85 years and over, this becomes a tipping point where just over half of carers are men, and this is related to demographics around longevity and the differences in longevity between older men and women. We know from Carers UK research that carers of all ages report loneliness and social isolation as issues. So loneliness is often flagged up as a major concern for carers. In relation to older carers, we know that there are challenges, additional challenges to caring and caregiving day to day, which are exacerbated by health declines associated with aging. And often older carers are living with their own health conditions and concerns that they have to manage as well as the person they're caring for. And we know for the majority of older carers that the person they're caring for are often spouses with dementia. And some of the literature talks about older men as carers taking a very managerial, task-oriented approach to caring, which overlaps with ideas about what it means to be a man, and ideas about doing masculinities and behaving in masculine ways. And this can often create barriers and reluctance to seeking help and support with caregiving responsibilities. So I'll come back to this idea about the way in which men do caring. So in our study, we spoke to 25 carers, 68 to 92 years. You can see the different significant others that people were caring for, whether it's mostly spouses, and 11 of those spouses were living with dementia. For 2 men close friends, for 4 men, they were caring for adult children, and 1 man was caring for a grandson with his spouse. And in contrast to men who are single living alone, carers describe loneliness as a fleeting experience. It wasn't a constant concern. It was almost like a shadow in the background, which sometimes emerged. Sometimes it was more felt when a participant was experiencing the first time of the day on their own. So, for example, when they had assisted their spouse or the person they're caring for to go to bed, and they, for the first time, they had a few minutes on their own. That's when they suddenly felt that brief sense of separation and potential loneliness. But it wasn't a constant concern. And a lot of the men spoke about caring, their responsibilities and their bonds with the person they were caring for as a buffer to loneliness. So the companionship of the person receiving care acted as a buffer to those feelings of loneliness that some of the men in the other group spoke about. A lot of men were aware of loneliness as a future rather than current problem. So they had many future-oriented concerns about financial difficulties in the future, about what happened if they died before the person they were caring for, or the person they were caring for died before they did. There were a whole range of different concerns, and I'm sure many people here who worked with carers and supported carers will recognize some of these concerns. And loneliness was one of those. So it's more of a future problem. What happens when I'm on my own? Or what happens when the person I'm caring for is on their own? What's that going to look like for them? But they did talk about isolation and feeling cut off from others, especially in crisis situations. So there was this sense of isolation more so than loneliness. A couple of quotes there that I'll let you have a look at. I'll just pause for a second. The second participant there, M53, is talking about the loneliness that comes from the total responsibility of caring. Because you've got to do everything, so whether that confuses your brain to say that, you know, well, you're on your own, you're basically on your own. When there are people here, as in people in the house, it's fine. If they come and look after her, his partner, I go away, but I come back to it. So some men did touch on these kind of brief moments of loneliness in their day-to-day caring. A lot of men talked about their social life as shrinking outside the caring relationships. They talked about diminished contact with friends and social groups. So this person here is talking about caring for his spouse with Alzheimer's. And he says, I think since the Alzheimer's has kicked in, whether it is loneliness or whether it is a feeling of, I don't want to do this anymore, I wish I could go out and have a pint. That happens more frequently. And other men talked about missing being able to go to the pub, missing having a meal out with friends as a couple, as well as with friends on their own. So this is where we start to see a lean towards this idea about social loneliness, more so than emotional loneliness. So we start to see some indications that men are experiencing a yearning for increased contact with people in their social networks, including friends, that they similar to what they used to experience before they took up caring responsibilities. And I want to finish by talking about what men valued about groups, because as I mentioned before, we're interested in about men's participation in groups. Some quick messages across the whole study. So men across all our different groups talked about they valued increased opportunities for social interaction and forming new friendships. A lot of men across groups talked about the value of mixed generational relationships, groups. Both heterosexual and gay men spoke about this and not wanting to be siloed in groups for old people. All men spoke about the importance of social ties, and some men talked about the value of emotional ties, and we see this with the carers group. And a lot of men spoke about the importance of making an active contribution to group activity. They didn't want to be a passive service recipient. They wanted an active role in the design, planning, and managing of the group, and that included volunteering. So the benefits for carers, so a small number of our sample were involved in carers groups. Benefits included gaining social and emotional connections, receiving emotional support and practical help with caregiving, the value of mutual support from other carers and coming together over shared experience. And this is where we see both emotional and social ties around this identity or this common experience of being a carer. And the ways in which being part of those groups helped counteract that isolation felt in the caregiving relationship, that you're not the only one. And just to flag this up as a quote from one of our carers about the main thing of being part of a group is that in a way you're not the only one, and the value of coming together with other carers. And to finish my last finding slide, there were some troubles or challenges about taking part in carers groups. Sometimes the structure and contents of sessions were unappealing, or they didn't fit with carers' day-to-day routines and how they had to prioritise the needs of the carer, the person they are caring for. Staff turnover was a significant issue, a lot of frustrations about continual changes in group facilitators, and related to that, less contact with healthcare professionals. Some men felt quite frustrated about the lean towards doing activities together with older carers, about having some pleasurable time together, enjoying the company rather than getting information and getting more practical help. Some men had worries about their spouse or partner attending, how that might limit the conversation, some sense of embarrassment, for example, if the person that accompanied them fell asleep during the group discussion. And a couple of men talked about the difficulties of participating in carers groups where the majority of members were women, and how that might also shape or limit some of the conversation for them. So concluding thoughts in my last 2 minutes, if that's okay, Catherine. About recognising loneliness, we need to recognise how older men from diverse backgrounds and circumstances experience loneliness in different ways, and think about how we plan interventions appropriately, and not just plan interventions, but how we facilitate conversations appropriately, and recognise that men may be experiencing different forms of loneliness, if indeed loneliness is a problem for them. And for men who are single, living alone, feelings of loneliness often accompanied by these wider messages about social estrangement and exclusion. And it raises some really big questions about how we foster social inclusion of older men in later life. And again, particularly men who are single and living alone. As I mentioned before, for carers, social loneliness was more of a problem, and isolation associated with being in that caring relationship. Whereas for men who are single living alone, they tended to speak more about emotional loneliness and existential loneliness. And to finish on some messages for running groups for older men, men across the subgroups in our study valued being active contributors to group design, the delivery, the management. They don't want to be clients of a service or service users. And also a message there about preferring mixed generational groups and having contact with men from different age groups. Some carers seeking more instrumental professional support, but majority of carers seeking both, that emotional support and bonds with other carers, as well as the instrumental practical support. Carers groups also highly valued amongst those who attend them, but need for flexibility in delivery and consistency in who facilitates those. With Age UK, we've produced a whole range of resources, a guidance for practitioners on what works with running groups for older men, information sheet for older men and their families. And there are 3 short films, that's my timer. There are 3 short films capturing men's perspectives on this topic. And one of those films includes carers' perspectives. So please visit the website and please make use of those resources. Thank you.
Fantastic, Paul. Thank you for a fascinating presentation. Thanks for keeping to time. You and Mark both did a great job on that. So we've got a few minutes now for questions. So I can see one's coming in. Please do keep adding, because if we don't manage to cover them now, we can leave them with Paul to think through. So a question, Paul, for you about a potential bias in the sample, in the sense that these are people who belong to a network to alleviate loneliness. What about the lonely that don't belong to networks?
That's a really good point. And as a key aim of this study was to learn about participation in group-based activities and groups, and how that might help alleviate and reduce loneliness. So we were fortunate in being able to gather all those accounts and that data. But the offshot of that is that that person's quite right. We weren't able to capture the perspectives of those people who are extremely isolated, who may have contact with, you know, one other person once a week. And we know for people in social care and social work, that can encompass a lot of older people with care and support needs, living with disabilities or caring for others. So it is a limitation to our study, and I think it's definitely an area for future research needed.
Fantastic, thanks, Paul. I mean, I guess one related question I had was about the sort of the identity of carer, that's something that particularly in spousal relationships, people can sometimes be quite unwilling to sort of take on that identity. And I suppose they may then be the people who, for whose loneliness is, you know, is part of that kind of not wanting to take that step into being identified with the kind of caring community, and to sort of to join in that way.
Yes. I think this comes back to the methodology and the research design, because we recruited carers through carers groups and carer support services. So in many ways, the men that we'd spoken to had not necessarily taken on that carer identity, but were fully immersed in that caring role and that caring relationship. So they'd kind of been through that journey that you're talking about, or that transition that you're talking about, in terms of getting to grips about, you know, I've reached this point in my life. I'm now having to care for this person. This isn't what I set out to do. This isn't how I envisioned my life. But so I suppose the men that we've spoken to were very much immersed in the role, and I have to say, extremely dedicated to the person we're caring for. So I used that word responsibility before, but I have to frame that that's my language around caring, and a lot of the men we spoke to wouldn't talk about it as a responsibility. They would talk about it as part of their relationship and connection with their child, with their spouse, with their partner. So more about the importance of emotional, performing the caring role because of that emotional tie and bond.
I wonder how much, I mean, I don't know much about the loneliness literature, but I wonder how much in kind of thinking about responses to loneliness, it's useful to differentiate between the kind of what we might call the kind of intrinsic predispositions to loneliness versus the external changes as people get disconnected because of caring responsibilities or whatever. Is that something that's relevant to your study?
Yes, definitely. I think there were a small group of men, about 10 men, this is across the sample, not just carers now, who talked about the life challenges with loneliness. And as I mentioned before, who perceive themselves as long-term loners or lone wolves, or sometimes describe themselves as not being social animals. So these range of different metaphors that they, through which they view themselves. And for some of those men, they were related to adverse life circumstances. So some men had experienced adoption in the 50s and 60s as children, and they attributed those experiences to why they found it so difficult to form friendships, connections with others now in life. Some men had experienced long stays in hospital as children because of chronic illnesses. And again, being in hospital a long time in the 50s and 60s as a child would be a very traumatic experience in lots of ways. So there were some men who were very clear about pointing to these earlier life experiences as the anchors for why they experience loneliness now. I think what stands out with the carers group is that a lot of the men were quite clear that they are not lonely and that loneliness hadn't been a problem for them. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they haven't experienced difficulties with social isolation, or they haven't experienced difficulties with the lack of social contact with other people during their lifetime. But it does give us a clearer picture that their sense of loneliness now and their sense of isolation is more attributable to the current living situation, the extrinsic situation, rather than more longer term intrinsic factors.
Fantastic, thank you. And then another fascinating question, but just a quick answer on this one, which is, were there challenges in getting older men to talk about emotions and sort of sensitive topics?
In the main, no. When we asked that question about how would you describe loneliness, most men said, well, for me, it looks like this, this, and this. Some men were very brief in their responses, so we had to kind of keep coming back to it gently. And we also used the UCLA scale 3 questions, which are 3 questions related to loneliness, which are about measuring loneliness, but they don't actually use the word loneliness. So they talk about feeling left out or feeling cut off from others. So they were really useful questions in qualitative interviews, so not just for surveys, but in qualitative interviews for getting a deeper sense of what men's experiences were without using that word loneliness.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, Paul, thank you to you, and thank you again to Mark for a couple of fascinating and really complimentary presentations that I found really, really interesting. Thanks both for keeping to time, because I think that's a bit harder. I can't easily kind of wave at you maybe in the way that I would if we're in the room. So that's really helpful. Wanted to also thank the SSCR team at the LSE. It all happened, relatively smoothly. So given that many of us are fairly new to these technologies. Just to finish, a couple of things for your diary in terms of what's coming up. So the next session in this webinar series is on the 23rd of June. Again, that 1 to 2 lunchtime slot, and that's with the theme of dementia. So that'll be building on one that we had a few weeks ago on dementia. And there's also on the 10th of June, so tomorrow, 11 till 1, there's a capacity building webinar, again run by SSCR, which is about research ethics and adult social care research. So something that's close to many of our hearts, I'm sure, and lots to learn on how to continue to do that well. So those are things for your diary. I'm sure they'll both be fantastic sessions. So thanks to all. I know one of the team will be in touch sending the link to this webinar, so you can watch it again or pass it on or whatever, and hopefully we'll build up a great bank of these that the SSCR can hold. Fantastic. Thanks all, and hope to see you again on a call soon. Bye.
Thanks, Catherine.